The images are deeply disturbing. 9 bound men executed at point-blank range by the Sri Lankan government forces, obtained and broadcast by this program. It sparked an international outcry as Sri Lanka alleged the video was fake. Tonight, the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions has announced in New York that the footage is genuine. Sri Lanka has responded, calling his views ambiguous. A warning, this report that we will be seeing a little later contains some graphic footage. But let's first go to New York and to our correspondent, Sarah Smith. Sarah, just take us through what's actually happened tonight.
Well, the Special Rapporteur gave a press conference which I have to say was anything but ambiguous, in which he said very clearly that he believed 3 impartial, independent experts he'd commissioned to look at this tape all said they believed it was genuine. And he told me afterwards that if the events on that tape are real, then this definitely is a war crime. So he's taking this very seriously and has said that what needs to happen next is an independent investigation into the incident that's depicted on the tape, now that he has said it has been proven that the tape has not been tampered with, it's not a fake, it genuinely represents something that happened at the end of the war.
Now, if there was an inquiry into war crimes in Sri Lanka, and there are many who have called for this, who would carry it out?
Well, what the Special Rapporteur said today is it had to be somebody independent and impartial, and the UN themselves could supply those investigators. The problem is the UN cannot force Sri Lanka to accept an investigation or impose one on them. And the Special Rapporteur told me that the problem is, of course, unless the Sri Lankan authorities agree to cooperate, especially the military, then it will be impossible to identify the soldiers that you can see on the tape or work out where or when this incident took place.
Sarah, for the moment, let's pause and let's join Jonathan Miller, who has an account of what was originally transmitted and what's happened since.
After 26 years of cold-blooded killing by both sides, the Sri Lankan armed forces spectacularly defeated the Tamil Tigers last May. The Tigers' demise as violent and bloody as the campaign they'd waged for a homeland. With Tamil civilians caught in the crossfire, many claim targeted, allegations of brutal abuse by both sides. Then, last August, we were sent this chilling video. It depicts the execution of 9 bound, blindfolded men. We were told they were Tamils. Our source, a group of exiled Sri Lankan journalists, claimed it was filmed by a Sri Lankan soldier on his mobile phone last January. A senior Sri Lankan human rights investigator watched it with us and said he believed the footage was genuine. If it was, he said, it would indicate a serious breach of international law. The minute-long video ends as it started, with a point-blank execution. Our decision to broadcast the pictures caused a controversy which embroiled Channel 4 and went as far as the UN Secretary-General and the top echelons of the US government. Sri Lanka accused Channel 4 News of deceitful journalism and malicious intent. The Colombo government strenuously denied the authenticity of the footage, disputing the credibility of our source and demanding retraction. Today in New York, Philip Alston, the UN's Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions, announced he'd concluded that the video is genuine. He called for a war crimes investigation.
The conclusion clearly is that the videotape is authentic. I call for an independent inquiry to be established to carry out an impartial investigation into war crimes and other grave violations of international humanitarian and human rights law allegedly committed in Sri Lanka.
In his report, Philip Alston says that after viewing the pictures, he asked the Sri Lankan government to conduct an independent investigation. Initially, he says they refused. In September, a government spokesman was interviewed on this program about the UN Rapporteur's request.
Have you actually held the independent inquiry? Has it begun? And in what form is it independent?
I'm sorry, but we don't have to have so-called independent inquiries into any Tom, Dick and Harry allegation.
But the Sri Lankan government had already announced to a room full of foreign diplomats that they had scientifically established beyond any doubt that the video was a fake.
The Sri Lankan experts insisted that the footage couldn't possibly have been shot on a mobile phone. Their technical analysis concluded that there had been very amateurish video editing and crude audio dubbing.
The United Nations Special Rapporteur questioned the independence of the Sri Lankan experts, two of whom it turned out actually worked for the Sri Lankan armed forces. Today he branded their conclusions more impressionistic than scientific. Not impartial, he said. They had not been thorough. Jeff Spivak, the forensic video analyst, concludes that the technical attributes of the images were entirely consistent with mobile phone footage. He also said there was no evidence of editing or image manipulation. Mr. Spivak presented frame-by-frame analysis of video and audio recordings, rejecting Sri Lankan assertions that the footage had been tampered with. Dr. Daniel Spitz, the pathologist, concludes that the two executions appeared real. The body reaction, movement and blood evidence of both victims are entirely consistent with what you'd expect, he said. In his ballistics report, Peter Diachuk included a picture of the 7.62mm AK-47 assault rifle used in the shootings. He conducted experiments and videoed live firing. Recoil, movement of the weapon and the shooter, and the gases expelled from the muzzle in both shootings were consistent with firing live ammunition, he said. The three experts did raise some unexplained elements in the video. There's the question of the date embedded in the video file, which doesn't line up with when we were told it was filmed. There are also unexplained frames at the end of the footage. The pathologist questions two unexplained body movements among the apparently dead victims. The UN Special Rapporteur concludes that these anomalies aren't enough to undermine what he calls strong indications of authenticity. But the Sri Lankan government disagrees. Tonight, the foreign minister cast doubt on the UN's findings, telling a Colombo newspaper they were ambiguous. He accused the UN Special Rapporteur of playing politics, releasing his findings just before a presidential election. But on an island nation notorious for its failure to bring the perpetrators of extrajudicial killings to justice, these cold-blooded murders may finally be investigated, if the UN gets its way.
Despite the international appeals, the condemnation, the concern, the daily carnage of Tamil civilians inside the conflict zone of northern Sri Lanka goes on unabated. These are the most recent images from inside the zone from the makeshift hospital at Putumatalan. They were taken a few weeks ago, we understand. The date perhaps is not so important, the details are. Everywhere you see wounded civilians lying on floors, some scenes too horrible to show, of amputations and terrible injuries said to have been inflicted in the so-called no-fire zone. For doctors, it's a real battle to save lives.
This is the ICU, but we don't have any ICU bed, ICU facilities, cardiac monitor, glucometer, nothing. We can't do any investigation here. We don't have any laboratory facilities. We can't check the blood. Infection, blood test, urine test, any test we can do here. When they get the patient, we can treat blindly.
Aid organisations are increasingly voicing concern at the plight of the civilians. The UN has said 2,800 non-combatants, including hundreds of children, have been killed since January. Medical facilities are beyond even the most basic. Supplies are down to the bare minimum.
And see, there are all ICU patients, emergency patients, but we don't have any facilities here. We don't have any antibiotic and drugs also. We several times inform our government, but government not willing to send any medicine here. They are rejected. They are not willing to send here again.
The Sri Lankan military denies firing into the zone. The Tamil Tigers, or the LTTE, deny using the civilians as a human shield.
The LTTE is not stopping the Tamils from leaving. It's a false allegation by our enemies. Our people are determined and continue to stay here despite the attacks from our enemies. Our people are helping the fighters in every way possible to fight the Sri Lankan forces. They say they have to fight if they are to survive.
This is the first TV interview with a senior Tiger commander in the war zone who was responding to questions submitted by Al Jazeera. It was filmed a month ago, but there is no way of verifying the claims of either the Tamil Tigers or the government. The The Sri Lankan military has been battling for weeks for its so-called final victory, but the Tigers have been hanging on. They've inflicted casualties on the army, which refuses to reveal just how many. Thousands of Tamil civilians are said to be fleeing the conflict zone. The Sri Lankan military claims 50,000 have crossed the front line since January, but the UN says there are still another 190,000 trapped and in danger. Journalists are not allowed into the area. These pictures are the only visible indicator of what is actually happening. What we don't know is how many of these people have died since this video was taken, and how many more are still to die before this bloody conflict comes to an end. Tony Bertley, Al Jazeera.